Translate this. And my salary is yours." The words dropped into the kitchen like shards of glass. Richard Hale, a millionaire swollen with pride, tossed a stack of foreign contracts across the polished table. He laughed, loud and cruel, as the guests around him smirked. To them, Lillian Carter was nothing but the Maid 67, silver hair tied back, apron dusted with flour. What could she possibly know? Lillian's hand hovered over the papers. Her face betrayed nothing, but her silence tightened the air. A phone camera clicked on. A whisper passed through the room. Everyone waited to see her fail. Richard leaned back in his chair, smug. "Come on, Lillian. Prove us wrong, or admit you're nothing more than the help." But what he didn't know, what no one in that glittering room knew, was that this moment was the beginning of his downfall. The maid he mocked was about to change the balance of power forever. Where are you listening to this story from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, so you'll never miss stories that flip injustice on its head. Now, let me take you back to the night Lillian Carter refused to bow her head. The kitchen smelled of lemon polish and frying oil, the kind of scent that clung to the walls no matter how many times the windows were opened. Lillian Carter stood by the counter with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, wiping down silver trays until her shoulders ached. At 67, she moved slower than she once did, but her back was still straight. The sound of laughter came from the dining room, where Richard Hale entertained his guests with stories about acquisitions, mergers, and the kind of expensive wine that made people nod even if they didn't like the taste. Richard pushed through the swinging door, tall glass in one hand, a stack of papers in the other. He was a man of 55, barrel-chested, with the smug confidence of someone who thought money insulated him from shame. His voice carried like a whip crack. "Lillian," he called, and the chatter from the dining room dipped. "Come here a moment. We're about to give these folks a show." She set down the tray, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked forward. Richard dropped the papers on the table. The pages slid across the polished surface, contracts covered in tight columns of Spanish text. "Go on," he said loudly enough for his audience to hear. "Translate this for us, word for word. Do that, and my salary is yours." The guests roared. Marjorie Hale, Richard's wife, chuckled politely, though her eyes darted away as if embarrassed. A younger man in a blue suit smirked and whispered something that made the woman beside him stifle a laugh. Lillian glanced at the stack. She didn't flinch. She simply rested one palm on the papers, smoothing the corner. Richard's grin widened. "See, folks? I told you. She can barely manage the grocery list I leave her, and here she is, staring at international contracts. Imagine that." The laughter swelled again. A few guests raised their phones, pretending to check messages but angling the cameras. Lillian could feel the lenses on her like a heat lamp. Marjorie cleared her throat. "Richard, maybe this isn't." He cut her off. "What? It's harmless. She knows her place. Don't you, Lillian?" For a long moment, the kitchen was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. Lillian's hands, worn from decades of scrubbing and polishing, rested calmly on the papers. She lifted one page, her eyes moving slowly down the lines. Someone muttered, "She can't possibly." Another voice, sharper, "Why is she looking at it like she understands?" Richard barked a laugh. "Oh, don't get your hopes up. She's stalling. Watch." But she wasn't. Her lips moved without sound, tracing each phrase. She circled a word with her fingertip, then another, the way someone marks flaws on glass. "Translate it," Richard demanded, his voice climbing. "Do it now. Or admit you can't." Lillian lifted her head. Her eyes met his, steady and unblinking. For the first time, Richard shifted his weight, uneasy. The guests leaned forward. One woman whispered, "She looks like my old professor." Another frowned. Lillian didn't raise her voice. "Senor Hale," she said evenly. This clause here, cesión de propiedad, it doesn't mean transfer of services, as you claim. It means transfer of ownership. Whoever signs this isn't giving you permission to operate. They're giving you the property outright. The room stilled. A fork clattered to a plate. Richard blinked. What did you just say? You heard me, she replied. She tapped the page again. And here, vigencia immediata. That means immediate effect. No waiting period. The moment it's signed, control is gone. The man in the blue suit sat up straighter. She's right. That's accurate. Richard's smile faltered. He tried to laugh it off, but it came out brittle. Well, maybe she picked up a few words. Don't think she knows the rest. Lillian turned another page. This section, Article 12, makes you personally liable for all debts tied to the property, not your company, you. That's bankruptcy if you're not careful. The murmurs rose. Phones lifted higher, not even pretending anymore. Guests stared at Richard, not her. Marjorie's voice cracked. Richard, did you even read this? He snapped. Of course I did. His face reddened. She's bluffing. But the man in blue repeated, no, she isn't. His eyes flicked to Lillian with something closer to respect. Richard slapped the table. Enough. Lillian, get back to the kitchen. You're here to scrub pots, not pretend you're an attorney. Her voice was calm. I'm here to do my work. But tonight, you brought my work into this room. She let the page drop back to the table. And you will regret that. The silence that followed was heavier than any insult. Guests shifted uncomfortably. A woman near the door whispered, She's not just a maid, is she? Richard forced another laugh, but it sounded hollow now. Everyone relax. She's had her fun. He looked around, desperate to pull the power back into his hands. Come on, drinks are waiting. But nobody laughed with him. Their eyes stayed on Lillian Carter, the woman who moments ago was just a shadow in the kitchen, the woman who had spoken words Richard couldn't dismiss. She collected the scattered pages, stacked them neatly, and handed them back without trembling. Your salary, Mr. Hale, she said softly. I'll keep it in mind. For the first time all evening, Richard Hale had nothing to say. The party shifted back into motion, though the rhythm was no longer smooth. The clinking of glasses sounded too sharp, the laughter a shade too forced. Everyone kept glancing toward the doorway where Lillian Carter had disappeared, the maid who had spoken like a scholar. In the hallway outside the dining room, the other staff stood in uneasy clusters. Maria, the youngest housekeeper, whispered to the cook, Did you see her face? She wasn't scared at all. The cook, a stout man named Daniel, shook his head. I've worked here for 10 years. Never heard her speak like that. She knows something. Maria's eyes darted toward the kitchen. Do you think she really understood that contract? Didn't sound like guessing, Daniel muttered. Sounded like she'd read 100 just like it. Guests filtered out from the dining room, some under the pretense of using the restroom, others just curious. They slowed as they passed the kitchen door, lowering their voices. The corridor carried every whisper, every syllable bouncing off marble floors and polished wood panels. She translated that clause perfectly. No, Richard must have planted her. Some kind of performance trick. Performance? You saw his face. That wasn't acting. He was furious. Marjorie Hale stepped into the hall, her wineglass trembling in her hand. She caught sight of the murmuring guests and forced a brittle smile. Please, everyone, don't make too much of it. She's worked for us for years. A loyal maid, nothing more. But her voice lacked conviction. Inside the kitchen, Lillian stood at the counter again, polishing silver as if nothing had happened. Her movements were unhurried, each swipe of the cloth deliberate. Yet her posture was different, shoulders squared, chin lifted. She looked like someone waiting for a clock to strike. Maria hovered near the door. Miss Lillian? She whispered. Are you in trouble? Lillian didn't look up. Not tonight. Maria hesitated. The way you spoke, where did you learn all that? Finally, Lillian turned, eyes gentle. Child, 40 years of silence doesn't mean 40 years of ignorance. Before Maria could ask more, Richard's voice thundered from the dining room. Enough chatter. Music on. Drinks poured. Let's get back to celebrating. But the celebration had soured. People leaned together in corners, whispering behind raised hands. Who is she really? She knew terms my own lawyer uses. I swear I've seen her face before. Not just as a maid. The questions multiplied, like a current running under the floorboards. Back at the kitchen table, Lillian's phone buzzed softly in her apron pocket. She checked the screen. A single name lit up. Sofia Alvarez. She let it buzz once more, before sliding it open and pressing it to her ear. Miss Carter. Sophia's voice was crisp. Professional. I received your message. Do you want me to come now? Yes, Lillian answered quietly. Bring the file. Maria caught fragments of the conversation, her eyes widening. File? What file? But Lillian only tucked the phone away and resumed polishing. Upstairs, one of Richard's guests, a venture capitalist named Gregory Moss, spoke in low tones to another man. If that woman's right about the liability clause, Richard's deal is poison. He'll be ruined. The man frowned. Why would a maid know contracts better than us? Gregory's gaze hardened. Because she isn't just a maid. Mark my words. The whispers spread. By the fireplace, a woman typed furiously on her phone. At the bar, two men debated whether to leave before the evening collapsed completely. Marjorie returned to Richard's side, her smile frozen. She leaned close, voice sharp. You humiliated yourself. Everyone saw. Richard's jaw clenched. She embarrassed me in my own house. She embarrassed herself into looking smarter than you. Marjorie snapped. And people noticed. Richard slammed his glass onto the table, amber liquid sloshing over the rim. I'll have her out by morning. But in the hall, Daniel and Maria traded looks. They had seen too much arrogance crumble too fast. Something about Lillian's calm unsettled them more than Richard's fury. Near the coat closet, a pair of guests whispered. She held those papers like she owned them. What if she does? Lillian finally stepped into the hall, carrying a tray of fresh glasses. The corridor fell quiet as eyes followed her. She moved with unhurried grace, each step deliberate, as though the house itself adjusted to her rhythm. Excuse me, she murmured, sliding past the cluster of guests. The sound of her voice silenced their conversation completely. Maria whispered after her, She's not afraid of him. Not at all. Richard's laughter rang out again, forced and booming, but it didn't carry the same power. Guests exchanged glances, their smiles thin. The air was charged with questions. Back in the kitchen, Lillian set down the tray. She looked once at the old grandfather clock in the corner. Its pendulum swung steadily, each tick marking time. She whispered to herself, almost inaudible. It won't be long now. Maria, standing nearby, heard it anyway. A shiver ran down her spine. By the time dessert was served, whispers had become rumors. Richard Hale's empire suddenly seemed fragile, his authority punctured by a single voice that refused to bend. The guests stayed, but their loyalty shifted, drawn toward the quiet woman who had spoken truth, with no title, no power, at least none they could see. And upstairs, in the study lined with leather-bound books Richard never opened, the documents Lillian had mentioned waited in a locked drawer, ready to change everything once the right hands reached for them. The dining room lights glowed too brightly now, as though even the chandeliers were restless. Richard Hale kept pouring drinks with exaggerated cheer, but his guests no longer laughed on cue. They stole glances toward the kitchen, where Lillian Carter had retreated once more. Something about the quiet way she stood there, her hands folded, her gaze calm pulled their attention like gravity. At the far end of the table, Gregory Moss leaned toward his companion. If she's right, Richard is walking into a financial noose. I'd sell my shares tomorrow. His voice was low, but not low enough. The man beside him nodded grimly. Richard slammed the cork back into a bottle. "Everyone relax. She doesn't know what she's talking about. She's a maid. A maid." His words cracked like glass against marble, but the force sounded desperate now. Marjorie Hale touched his arm, her fingers stiff. "Richard, enough. You're only making it worse." In the kitchen, Lillian dried her hands on her apron. Her phone buzzed again, steady and insistent. She slid it from her pocket and checked the screen. Sofia Alvarez. She hesitated only a moment before pressing accept. "Miss Carter," Sofia said, her voice quick, precise. "I'm outside. Do you want me to come in?" "Yes," Lillian replied quietly, eyes flicking toward the doorway. "But through the side entrance. Bring the file I asked for. I have it. Signed copies, sealed. Good." 15 minutes. Maria, still hovering near the pantry, caught fragments of the call. "Who's Sofia?" she whispered. Lillian tucked the phone away without answering. Instead, she glanced at the grandfather clock again. The pendulum swung, each tick sharper than the last. When she stepped back into the hall with a tray of glasses, conversation dwindled again. She moved between clusters of guests, setting Crystal down with practiced care. No one spoke to her directly, but eyes followed her every move. She doesn't carry herself like a servant. She knew those clauses. "I checked on my phone, she was right," Richard barked. "Stop gossiping." His voice was too loud, too brittle. He drained his glass in one swallow. Then, cutting through the tension, Lillian's phone buzzed again. This time, she didn't silence it. She answered in front of everyone. "Yes, Sofia. You may enter now." The room fell still. Richard's brow furrowed. Who the hell is Sofia? Lillian ended the call and slipped the phone back into her apron. Her eyes rested on Richard for a long, unbroken moment. "You'll see." Minutes later, the side door opened. A young woman in a dark suit stepped in, her briefcase clasped firmly. Her hair was pulled back, her stride confident. Guests murmured. Richard's face tightened. "Who are you?" he demanded. The woman extended her hand politely. "Sofia Alvarez, attorney." "Attorney?" Richard scoffed. "For who?" "Certainly not for me." "No," Sofia said evenly. "For Miss Carter." The air cracked. Someone coughed. A guest muttered, "Miss Carter," as though tasting the name for the first time. Richard barked a laugh. "You're joking. She can't afford an attorney. She can barely." Lillian's voice cut in, calm but firm. "Richard, enough." It was the first time she had spoken his name directly, without sir, without hesitation. Heads turned at the authority in her tone. Sofia set her briefcase on the sideboard and clicked it open. She withdrew a slim folder and laid it on the table between the wine bottles. "These are copies of the inheritance documents, notarized and filed. Property transfer details included." Richard's face went red. "What inheritance?" Sophia's tone sharpened. "The one you pretended didn't exist." Marjorie clutched her glass. "Richard, what is she talking about?" Richard stammered. "Lies. All of it." But sweat glistened on his forehead. Lillian stepped forward. Her voice was steady, measured. 40 years ago, the original owner of this house, Eleanor Whitfield, left instructions in her will. Half of this property, half of everything, was to remain under the stewardship of her housekeeper. That housekeeper was my mother. Upon her passing, the rights transferred to me. Gasps rippled around the room. Maria covered her mouth. Daniel muttered, "Lord have mercy." Richard's laugh was hollow now. Absurd. No one would leave a mansion to a servant. Sophia's eyes flashed. "The documents are clear." Signed, witnessed, and enforceable. She tapped the folder. And if you continue to deny it, we can resolve the matter in court tomorrow morning. But I doubt you'll enjoy the headlines. One of the guests whispered, "She owns part of the house?" Another replied, "Not just owns, inherited." Marjorie's hand trembled. "Richard, is this true?" He glared at her, then at Lillian. "This is my house. My empire. You don't belong here." Lillian's eyes did not waver. "Richard, I belong here more than you ever did." The words struck harder than any shout. Guests exchanged glances. The balance in the room had shifted. Invisible, yet undeniable. Sophia closed the briefcase with a snap. "Miss Carter, everything is ready. When you give the word, we'll proceed with filing." Lillian nodded slowly. She turned to face the gathered guests, her voice quiet, yet carrying. "For years I have worked in silence. Tonight, silence ends." Richard lunged for the folder, but Sophia slid it away before his hand touched it. His face purpled. "You think you can humiliate me in front of my peers?" "No," Lillian replied calmly. "You did that yourself." The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. The ripples spread through every whisper, every glance, every silent judgment. Outside, the clock struck 10. Its chime echoed through the halls, long and resonant, like the sound of a verdict being read. Inside, Richard Hale realized for the first time that the maid he mocked was no longer standing in his shadow. She was standing in his way. The dining room had become a courtroom without a judge. Crystal glasses gleamed untouched. Silver cutlery lay forgotten, and the air pressed down with the weight of unsaid words. Richard Hale paced at the head of the table, his face flushed, his tie tugged loose. Guests sat stiffly, some staring at their laps, others bold enough to keep their phones half raised, recording. In the center of it all, Lillian Carter remained motionless. She stood by the stack of contracts as though she had been planted there, rooted in patience. When she finally spoke, the hush was immediate. "Mr. Hale," she said evenly, "you demanded that I translate your documents. Allow me to finish the task you mocked me for." A few guests straightened in their seats. Marjorie's lips parted, as if she wanted to stop this spectacle but couldn't summon the strength. Richard laughed harshly. "This is absurd. You think reciting foreign words will scare me?" Lillian ignored him. She lifted one page and began reading the Spanish text aloud. Her tone, fluid, confident, without hesitation. After each passage, she translated it into English, her cadence precise, unhurried. Section 8. All rights of transfer are binding in perpetuity. Section 9. Any violation will result in forfeiture of assets. The words cut sharper than any insult. A man in the corner, a banker by trade, muttered, "She's correct." Heads turned toward him, then back to Lillian. Richard's voice rose. "You're just performing. You don't understand the meaning behind those words." But another guest shook her head. "She understands them better than you." With each clause, Lillian laid bare the risks Richard had ignored. She never raised her voice, never hurried. Instead, her restraint magnified the tension, like a teacher patiently correcting a careless student in front of the class. Maria watched from the doorway, her hands pressed to her chest. She had never seen anyone dismantle Richard's bluster so completely. Daniel the cook whispered, "She's not arguing, she's documenting." By the time she reached the final page, the mood of the room had shifted entirely. No one doubted her now. Even Marjorie, once Richard's shield, was staring at him with something colder than disappointment. Lillian placed the papers back on the table, aligning the corners with care. "You asked me to translate," she said softly. "Now the truth is clear. This agreement is not business. It is surrender." Silence gripped the room. Phones recorded every breath. Richard slammed his fist on the table, rattling glasses. "This means nothing. She's twisting words to humiliate me." But no one rallied to him. Guests who once laughed at his jokes now avoided his gaze. The house staff, lingering in the doorway, looked at Lillian with a mixture of awe and relief. Sofia Alvarez stepped forward, her briefcase at her side. "The documents Miss Carter referenced are already verified. What you've just witnessed is not performance. It is the system itself, spoken aloud. If you make sure that..." The words landed like a verdict. Guests whispered, some slipping discreetly toward the door, unwilling to be linked to Richard's unraveling. Richard's face contorted, half fury, half disbelief. He had built his reputation on bluster and intimidation, but both failed him now. Every eye had shifted to Lillian, the woman he had thought invisible, and Lillian, she did not gloat. She simply folded her hands and stood in silence, as though she had all the time in the world. The stakes were no longer Richard's pride. They were his empire, and everyone in the room knew it. The atmosphere in the Hale estate shifted from unease to open fracture. Guests no longer pretended to sip their drinks or laugh at Richard's hollow jokes. They leaned in, whispering to each other, glancing at their screens as messages and articles began to circulate. Someone had already uploaded a clip of Lillian Carter translating the contract. Within minutes, it was bouncing from phone to phone, rippling outward. "Look at this," one woman muttered, showing her screen to the man beside her. "People are already calling her the maid who knows the law," Richard barked. "Turn those damn phones off." His voice cracked like a whip, but no one moved. In the corner, Marjorie sat stiffly, her pearls clutched in one hand. She wasn't looking at her husband anymore. Her gaze followed Lillian, who stood near the sideboard, serene as stone. Sofia Alvarez, calm and sharp, opened her briefcase again and began sliding papers onto the table. "Here are copies of the deed, the will, and the inheritance clause," she announced, her voice crisp, professional. Gasps moved across the room. A banker leaned forward, his hands twitching to touch the documents. That's legitimate." Richard lunged forward. "You're trespassing in my home, spreading lies." Sofia didn't flinch. "I was invited by Miss Carter. She holds legal standing here." The words traveled like a tremor. Guests looked from Sofia to Lillian, then back to Richard, who stood red-faced, sweating, suddenly small beneath the chandelier. Maria, peeking in from the doorway, whispered to Daniel, "Do you hear that? Legal standing." Daniel exhaled heavily. "This isn't just talk. This is real." Across the dining table, Gregory Moss typed furiously on his phone. "I'm getting alerts already. Investors are asking questions about Richard's deal. If this contract's exposed, he's finished." Richard's composure frayed. He tried to shout over the whispers, but every outburst only made him look weaker. Lillian never raised her voice. She moved slowly to the head of the table, placed one hand on the document Sofia had spread out, and said simply, "The truth is moving now. And you can't stop it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Phones buzzed, screens lit up, news tickers were catching on. The maid with the silver hair, the woman dismissed as invisible, was becoming a story. Marjorie rose halfway from her chair. Her voice wavered. "Lillian, is it true? You're part owner of this house?" "Yes," Lillian answered. She spoke without triumph, only calm certainty. "And more than that, I have the authority to protect what was meant to be preserved, not exploited." Sofia handed her a pen. The small gesture sent another wave of whispers around the room. Richard reached out as if to snatch it away, but no one moved to help him. Even Marjorie pulled back. "You see?" Lillian said softly. "It is not me raising my voice that changes things. It is the system you ignored, the paper you mocked, the truth you thought no one would ever read." Richard stood frozen, his empire collapsing not with an explosion, but with a series of quiet acknowledgments. One nod from a banker. One gasp from a guest. One ping from a phone announcing headlines already spreading. Revelations moved through the room like a tide, unstoppable, leaving Richard stranded on an island of his own arrogance. And in the center of it stood Lillian Carter, composed, unshaken, waiting for the moment she had known would come. The Hale dining room no longer belonged to Richard. It hummed with a new kind of energy, uncertain, heavy, expectant. Guests spoke in quick bursts, their voices clipped, their phones buzzing with news that seemed to multiply by the second. Sofia Alvarez's documents were spread across the polished mahogany, like evidence at trial. Richard stood at the head of the table, sweat on his brow, his glass still in hand, though untouched. His voice, once booming, had thinned to a rasp. "You can't just walk in here and claim ownership. This is my house, my name on the deed." Sofia's tone was sharp as a blade. "Check the addendum, Richard. You never noticed it because you never read past the first page. But Miss Carter's rights are written in black and white." Gasps fluttered again. A man in a navy blazer muttered, "He didn't even read it?" Richard's hand slammed the table. "Enough," he barked. "All of you, out. This is private family business." But no one moved. Some even leaned closer. The performance had grown too compelling. Lillian Carter stepped forward, her movements unhurried, her silver hair catching the chandelier light. She placed both palms flat on the documents, as if steadying them against the storm of Richard's fury. "Richard," she said quietly, but the quiet was what silenced the room. "For years, you've mocked me. Tonight you tried to humiliate me, in front of your guests. But these papers," she slid one toward him with her fingertips, "they don't lie. You can shout until your voice breaks, but the truth remains." Marjorie's face was pale, her pearls trembling against her collarbone. "Richard," she whispered, "is it true? Did you ignore all of this?" He tried to meet her gaze, but failed. His eyes darted toward the door, as though escape were still possible. One of the guests, Gregory Moss, checked his phone and announced, "It's online." A clip of her reading the contract. Already thousands of views. The words landed like a blow. Richard staggered, his authority unraveling faster than he could contain it. Lillian lifted another page, her voice steady. "This section binds you personally to the debts of your failed ventures." "You wanted me to translate, Richard? Then listen well. You are not just reckless. You are bankrupt the moment this contract is signed." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath. Richard's glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. Still, no one bent to clean it. Sofia closed her briefcase with a decisive snap. "Miss Carter, everything is ready for filing. All that remains is your word." Richard spun toward her. Her word? She's nothing. A maid. But his protest faltered when Lillian stepped fully into his space. Her eyes locked on his. "Not tonight," she said. Her voice was low, calm, final. Guests shifted forward, sensing the moment tightening. Marjorie's hand rose to her lips. Maria and Daniel stood frozen in the doorway. Even Sofia's posture straightened, as though bracing for impact. Lillian leaned slightly closer, her next words sliced through the silence like steel. "And starting tonight, Richard, I am the one who gives orders here." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, the metallic ping of another phone capturing the instant. Richard's jaw hung open, rage and disbelief colliding on his face. He looked around for someone, anyone, to defend him. No one did. For the first time in his own house, Richard Hale was utterly alone. The storm broke, not with thunder, but with paper. Sofia Alvarez drew a thicker folder from her briefcase and slid it into the center of the dining table. The sound of leather against wood carried more force than Richard Hale's voice ever had. Every head turned. "These," Sofia said, her words clipped and deliberate, "are the original documents. Probate filings. Transfer of rights. The inheritance clause your lawyers missed or ignored. Richard lurched forward, his tie swinging. Don't listen to her. She's bluffing. Bluffing. Sophia's voice cut across his light glass. She flipped open the folder, revealing notarized seals, signatures, official stamps. The proof glowed under the chandelier light. I'm prepared to submit these to the county clerk at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Once filed, there will be no dispute. But you should understand this property is not solely yours. Miss Carter holds half. Half. The word landed like a hammer. The guests stiffened. A woman near the fireplace whispered, half the estate? Another guest, a banker, leaned forward, eyes wide. That means every decision requires her approval. Richard's face flushed crimson. Nonsense. Fabrications. He reached across the table, but Sophia snapped the folder shut and slid it to Lillian Carter, who calmly rested her hand on it. This is my mother's legacy, Lillian said. Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. She served this house faithfully for decades. The Whitfield family recognized her loyalty, her sacrifice. They ensured the estate would never pass entirely into careless hands. Marjorie's pearl necklace trembled in her grasp. Richard, is this true? Did you know? His lips parted, but no sound came. The silence said enough. Lillian straightened, her back unbending despite the years etched into her frame. You mocked me tonight, Richard. You laughed, certain that a maid could never read what you dismissed. But the truth is written here. This house does not belong to you alone. It belongs to me as well. Phones lifted again. Screens glowed, catching her words, her steady posture. Somewhere beyond those walls, the story was already spreading. No longer just whispers, but a current racing outward. Richard tried again, his voice cracking. Even if that's true, you're nothing without money. You think you can run an estate, pay the taxes, manage the staff? Lillian's gaze was steady. I managed your home every day for years while you sat in boardrooms pretending to command empires. I know its bones, its rhythms, its people. This house knows me better than it will ever know you. Daniel, the cook, shifted his weight. Maria's hands clutched her apron, her eyes wet with awe. Around the room, staff who had lived in Richard's shadow straightened, sensing the wind change. Sophia opened the folder again, sliding a single page across the table. Clause 15, she said. Ownership split, 50% to Richard Hale, 50% to Lillian Carter. Richard's jaw worked soundlessly. The banker spoke again, almost in disbelief. She's not just a co-owner. She can block any sale, any mortgage, any agreement. Without her signature, he's powerless. The truth spread through the room like fire catching dry wood. Richard tried one last time, his voice hoarse. This is my empire. No, Lillian said, her tone as firm as oak. It never was. You inherited position, not respect. You bought walls, not loyalty. And tonight, you've lost both. The silence after her words was not empty. It was charged. Guests glanced at each other, recognizing that something irrevocable had shifted. Richard Hale, the millionaire who had strutted through the night, was no longer master of his house. Lillian Carter was. Sophia closed the folder, her expression calm but fierce. The law stands with her. You may resist, but you will lose. Richard staggered back, staring at the woman he had dismissed as a servant, realizing too late she was the one person who could unmake him. And in that chandelier-lit room, with every guest watching, every phone recording, every whisper solidifying into fact, Lillian Carter stepped fully into her inheritance, not just of bricks and land, but of power. The house had gone still after the revelation, but it wasn't the silence of confusion anymore. It was the silence of shifting allegiance. People knew where the power now resided, and it wasn't with Richard Hale. Lillian Carter remained at the head of the table, her hand resting calmly on the inheritance folder. Sophia Alvarez stood at her side, steady as a sentry. Richard looked smaller than he ever had, collar loose, fists clenched, his breath heavy. "Daniel," she said, her tone steady, authoritative. "From this moment forward, you are no longer answering to Mr. Hale. You will continue in your role, but under my direction." Daniel blinked, startled, then nodded with surprising swiftness. "Yes, Miss Carter." His shoulders lifted as if decades of weight had just slipped away. Richard barked, "You can't just—" But Lillian ignored him. She looked to Maria. "You've worked tirelessly without proper pay. Effective immediately, your wages will be doubled. I will see the paperwork signed tonight." Maria's eyes filled with tears. She pressed her apron to her mouth, nodding furiously. Richard pounded the table. "You have no authority to change salaries. None." Sophia cut him off smoothly. "On the contrary, as co-owner, Miss Carter has full authority to establish employment terms. If you attempt to override her, you will be in breach of the ownership agreement and in court by morning." The room buzzed. Guests whispered, "She's really doing it. She's taking control." Lillian moved her gaze across the room, not to the glittering chandelier or the polished marble floors, but to the faces, the staff, the guests, even Richard's wife. "This house has been run on arrogance for too long. That ends tonight." She gestured toward the stack of contracts. "Any agreement signed under deception is void. Effective immediately, all negotiations will be halted until both owners review them." Sophia produced her phone. "I've already drafted the notification to Mr. Hale's partners. With your approval, Miss Carter, it will be sent in minutes." "Send it," Lillian said. The room shifted palpably as Sophia tapped her screen. Within moments, Richard's empire trembled. Deals paused, phones buzzed with alerts, and every guest present knew they were watching the collapse of a man's power in real time. Richard staggered back, his voice breaking. "You're destroying everything I built." Lillian looked at him evenly. "No, Richard, you destroyed it yourself with your greed, your contempt, your blindness. I'm only resetting the system you poisoned." Marjorie Hale stood slowly, her face pale but resolute. She glanced between her husband and Lillian. "At last," she whispered. "She's right." Richard's mouth fell open. "Marjorie, you—" But Marjorie didn't let him finish. She turned to Lillian and nodded once, firmly. "If you mean to lead, then lead. This house will be better under you." Gasps rippled, and Richard's final defenses crumbled. Lillian drew herself tall, her voice carrying through every corner of the room. "From this day forward, no worker in this house will be dismissed or humiliated without just cause. Pay will be fair. Respect will be demanded. And every contract tied to this estate will be examined under honest light." Her words rang against the marble walls like a bell announcing a new era. The staff straightened, guests leaned forward, and Richard Hale, once the master of everything, looked like a man already erased. The reset had begun. The following morning, the Hale estate no longer resembled a mansion prepared for celebration. It felt like a command center. Long dining tables had been cleared of crystal and china, replaced with folders, laptops, and hurriedly scribbled notes. The very room where Richard Hale had strutted hours before now held a different kind of authority, one commanded quietly but firmly by Lillian Carter. She sat at the head of the table, Sophia Alvarez to her right, Daniel and Maria close by, and 3 local officials who had responded to Sophia's urgent calls. Even Marjorie Hale, pale and subdued, had taken a seat, her jewelry stripped away, hands folded in silence. Lillian's voice carried without effort. "This house was run on intimidation. That ends here. If we want it to stand, we must rebuild its foundation tonight." Sophia opened a folder. "First priority, freeze all contracts Richard attempted to finalize. Notification has already gone out to partners. They've acknowledged receipt." One official added, "And the county has confirmed the inheritance clause." Miss Carter's authority is undisputed. Murmurs of agreement circled the table. Richard, banished to the far corner of the room under quiet watch from a security officer, fumed but said nothing. His eyes darted between the officials and Lillian, but he had been reduced to a spectator. Maria leaned forward timidly. Miss Carter, the staff wages. Will those promises still hold? Lillian turned to her, eyes warm. They will hold, Maria. Not as charity, but as justice. Every worker in this house will be paid fairly and treated with dignity. Daniel, his arms crossed, muttered, "About time someone said it plain." Sophia tapped her notes. Second priority, restructure estate management. A transparent ledger will be created, accessible to staff as well as ownership. No hidden debts, no deceptive contracts. The officials nodded. That level of accountability will set precedent in this county. Other estates may be forced to follow. Lillian folded her hands. Let them. If fairness can spread beyond these walls, then this upheaval is worth it. She looked around the room, faces weary but alert. Some still skeptical, many hopeful. This is not about revenge, she said softly. Yet the words carried weight. It is about order, about repairing what arrogance broke. At the far end, Richard could no longer hold back. He rose, voice ragged. You think you can run this? You're a maid with delusions of grandeur. The security officer stepped closer, but Lillian only lifted a hand. Sit down, Richard. You'll speak when you learn to listen. The room froze. He hesitated, then sat, his fury collapsing under the authority in her tone. And with that, the meeting continued, swift, deliberate, historic. In a single night, the system that Richard Hale had corrupted began its emergency reform. And at its helm stood Lillian Carter, the maid who refused to remain invisible. By the end of the week, the Hale estate was no longer just a house under new management. It was a symbol. News outlets ran the story endlessly. The maid who became co-owner. Clips of Lillian Carter reading the contract played across television screens, her calm voice dissecting Richard Hale's arrogance line by line. Social media lit up with commentary. She stood her ground like a queen. Every worker needs a Lillian Carter. This isn't just gossip, it's justice. Reporters crowded the gates, their cameras capturing the steady stream of visitors. Union leaders requested meetings. Local pastors called Lillian's stand a sermon without a pulpit. Even professors of law cited her story as proof that literacy and dignity were the true foundations of power. Inside the estate, reform spread like wildfire. Staff from neighboring mansions appeared at the gates, hopeful and anxious. One gardener confessed, "They pay us nothing for overtime. Could you speak for us too?" Lillian didn't promise miracles, but she promised attention, and that was more than they had ever been given. County officials began drafting proposals to review long-ignored inheritance clauses in other estates. A councilwoman announced on the evening news, "What happened in the Hale household has shown us that old contracts can protect the vulnerable, if only we have the courage to enforce them." Richard Hale, once untouchable, became a parable of downfall. His name circulated less as a mogul and more as a cautionary tale. Guests who had once toasted his success now avoided his calls, unwilling to be linked to his disgrace. Marjorie retreated quietly, her public silence interpreted as tacit approval of Lillian's leadership. But the most powerful shift came from ordinary people. Retired maids, janitors, and cooks across the county began writing letters. Some arrived in envelopes with shaky handwriting, others in neat typed lines. One note read, "For the first time, I feel seen." Another simply said, "Thank you for standing tall, so we don't have to bow." Sophia Alvarez organized these messages into a binder, laying it before Lillian one afternoon. "This," she said, "is your ripple effect. You didn't just reset one house. You've given voice to thousands." Lillian traced a wrinkled finger over the pages, her eyes lingering on the names. She spoke softly, almost to herself. My mother used to tell me, every stone thrown into water makes circles, some small, some wide. You never know how far they'll reach. Outside, the circles had already begun spreading into workplaces, into living rooms, into the conscience of a society that had overlooked too many voices for too long. And at the center of every circle stood the quiet figure of Lillian Carter, silver-haired, steady, and undeniable. Months later, the Hale estate no longer felt like Richard Hale's fortress. Its gates stood open more often, welcoming community groups, church gatherings, and staff meetings that buzzed with real participation. The marble halls that once echoed with forced laughter now carried the sound of honest voices, people unafraid to be heard. Lillian Carter sat at the long table once used for Richard's hollow banquets. Papers spread before her, but not secret contracts or exploitative deals. These were budgets for staff housing upgrades, schedules for community workshops, and letters of thanks pinned together in careful stacks. Sofia Alvarez sat nearby, reading through legal drafts, while Maria entered with a tray of tea, no longer hesitant but smiling, her shoulders free of the weight she once carried. Reporters still came, though less frequently now. The frenzy had cooled into respect. They no longer asked only about Richard's downfall. They wanted to know what Lillian was building. One journalist wrote, "She turned humiliation into a blueprint, and her blueprint into change." Even county officials took cues from her. Transparency requirements tightened, labor protections expanded, and whispers began that statewide reform might trace its roots back to the quiet power of a former maid. Richard Hale, stripped of influence, vanished from public view. He became a cautionary tale in business schools. Arrogance blinds, but documents never forget. But for Lillian, victory was never about revenge. Sitting beneath the chandelier, she thought often of her mother, the woman who had dusted these rooms before her. Legacy, her mother once said, isn't about what you own. It's about what you leave standing for others. And so Lillian left more than her name on a deed. She left wages corrected, contracts made honest, and a system forced to acknowledge that dignity was not a luxury but a right. She left a reminder that even those dismissed as invisible carried power, waiting for the moment it would be claimed. One evening, as the staff gathered for supper in the great hall, seated not behind closed doors in a servant's kitchen, but at the same polished table where Richard once held court, Lillian raised her glass. Her voice, calm and resonant, carried to every ear. We were told to bow. We were told to be silent. But tonight, and every night forward, we sit together as equals. Dignity is not given. It is lived, and it is ours. The cheer that followed was not loud, but it was steady, carrying through the house, through the windows, and into the night. Lillian Carter's legacy was secured, not in marble, not in wealth, but in justice that would endure. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of Lillian Carter's story. What happened inside that mansion wasn't just a clash between a wealthy man and a woman he dismissed. It was a reminder that dignity doesn't fade with age, and respect is not reserved for the rich. Lillian stood in a room full of doubters, calm and unwavering, and showed us that silence can hold power until the right moment to speak. I share this story because many of us, especially women of color, know what it feels like to be underestimated, ignored, or laughed at. And yet, hidden in those quiet corners of our lives, there is a strength waiting to rise. Lillian didn't fight with rage. She fought with truth, with knowledge, with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime watching and waiting. Her victory is not just hers, it belongs to everyone who has ever been told to stay small. If this story moved you, let's keep it alive together. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Share this video with someone who needs a spark of courage. Hit the like button, and most importantly, Subscribe to this channel so you'll never miss the stories that prove power can rise from anywhere.